Great. I move on to the introductions. We have Jackie Bailey from the University of Texas, and Andrea Stevenson Wong, from Cornell University, and Tanya Aitamurto from the University of Illinois. I hope I have pronounced all the names properly. Well, Jackie Bailey is the current Scott C. and Vicky S. Reeve Endowed Faculty Fellow at the University of Texas at Austin. She completed her PhD in the Virtual Human Interaction Lab in the Department of Communication at Stanford University. Andrea Stevenson Wong is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell University and the director of the Virtual Embodiment Lab. She completed her PhD in the Virtual Human Interaction Lab in the Department of Communication at Stanford University. And Tanya Aitamurto is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She completed her PhD program at Tampere University, in which she studied most of the time as a visiting student researcher at Stanford also, and at UC Berkeley. So if I have the order here properly, we will start with Jackie Bailey, who will give us the talk, how the avatar moves the user, self-avatar embodiment and user behavior in immersive virtual reality. Go ahead, Jackie. Thank you.
That's a little bit of a trailer. That is an exciting thing. That's Andrew will be talking about that. But hello, everyone. Good afternoon, buenas tardes. I'm happy to be here. As I mentioned before, Brunella mentioned, I'm Jackie Bailey. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the United States. And I'm going to share my screen here, tell you a little bit about what I'll be sharing with you today. Okay. Well, my talk today will be about children's cognitive and social responses to virtual reality or VR characters. Okay, so this is what I like to do. I know people have their cameras off, but we're going to try a little bit of a experiment, a little audience participation here. And you can use your little button to like raise your hand, or if you want to show your face and raise your hand with your camera on, you can do that as well. So I always like to ask these questions because it's always interesting, because I've been really interested in kids and technology and how they experience it. So by the time you were the age of 10, what technology did you use or play with? And I'm going to give you a list, and I'd like you to raise your hand or put a star or a heart or whatever you'd like to do on your camera to indicate if you've done this by the time you were 10 years old. Okay. Did you use a desktop computer by the time you were 10 years old?
No.
Did you use a computer laptop? Did you use the internet?
No.
What about a smartphone or a mobile phone?
No.
Okay, what about a video game console or video games?
Yes.
Okay, television.
Yes.
Many people. And then what about a tablet, such as like an iPad or something like that? Probably not. Most of you are probably older than 14. But that's where we are, where kids are getting exposure and use of lots of different technologies as they develop in their life. They're getting more and more technologies that they can use. And we're in a new age of immersive and interactive technologies where kids are getting access to things that many of us here would not have had when they were younger. So for example, they're getting more accessible, more affordable, such as virtual reality. Back in 2015, so this is about 6 years ago, Sweden had released a line of happy goggles where you would go into a McDonald's, buy a kid's meal, you could take the box, turn it into a virtual reality headset, put your phone in there, and the kids could get access to McDonald's virtual reality content. Viewmaster, so Mattel has their own line of VR goggles, again, using a telephone for kids 7 years and older. And we also see, AR, augmented reality technologies that are available. Kids are interacting with artificial intelligence now. So they're interacting with Siri or Alexa, where they can ask questions and get answers from this disembodied voice. So again, they're becoming more affordable, more accessible, and kids are interacting with all these different types of new and immersive and interactive technologies. But what does that really mean now? What are the implications of immersive technology in children's lives? And that's a question that I've been interested in, and I'm starting to figure out how to answer that question, and I'll talk a little bit about how I'm going about answering that big question. And so today I'll talk a little bit about what is virtual reality. There are lots of different ways in this field that people define virtual reality, but I'm going to give you a definition that I will be using so you can understand what I mean when I say virtual reality, when I'm talking about the research here. And then I'm going to talk about some projects that I'm doing, one specifically looking at kids' cognitive, so how they're thinking and their social responses to virtual reality, specifically virtual reality characters. And then also thinking about what are kids' spontaneous reactions or spontaneous and automatic reactions to virtual reality, again, particularly characters in virtual reality. And then I'll discuss some future topics that I think are interesting that we can talk more about and do more research related to kids and technology, particularly immersive technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, or mixed reality. So first, let's get on the same page. What is virtual reality? I find more and more that it's a common phrase that more people and more kids are learning and understanding what it means. But in terms of the research world, I'm going to give you a big idea of what virtual reality is. So we can think about virtual reality as a technology, but also as an experience as well. So first, what is virtual reality as a technology? On a very basic level, it's something that consists of tracking people's behaviors, how you move in the physical world, rendering or updating that virtual environment based off of how you're moving, and then displaying that information in some way. So this is a throwback picture of the Oculus Rift, and it has a little device that looks like a little microphone stand. And that is tracking where people are moving their heads, for example. So there's the virtual reality headset that's kind of like a pair of goggles. It tracks where people are moving their heads, and they change the virtual environment to respond in a natural way. And they display that information visually, for example, but you can display it in terms of sounds, touch, even scent and taste in many cases. And so, for example, if you look in your room or wherever you are, and we made a virtual experience of that, you put your virtual reality headset on, you'd see a new version of your room. You take a step forward, and then it would redraw that to make things look bigger, to give the illusion that you're walking closer. So it's tracking your behaviors in the physical world, then updating that virtual environment based off of those movements, and then displaying it or giving you information back about your behaviors in the virtual environment. So that's virtual reality as a technology. But VR can be thought of broadly as also an experience, that you're somewhere else that feels real. And one of my favorite definitions of this is related to the concept of presence. So it feels as if that experience is real. And Ditton and Lombard have a great definition of this as the feeling of non-mediation. So the feeling that there's no technology between you and this new experience you're having. And I have a little picture here. This is a child from a colleague of mine back in the day. And she has a virtual reality headset on. So that's the technology. She sees a first-person view of a virtual world. And in that world, there's a blue fuzzy character named Grover. And Grover goes, "Hello, how are you? It's me, your lovable friend Grover." And we see her do a little bit of a shake. And then she goes, "Hello," and waves at him. And so we see that she's experiencing it as if it's real, as if Grover is really there. So virtual reality is not just a technology, but this experience that you are really there. You're really having this new experience someplace else. But how do those two things go together? I talked a little bit about that, but they found that the more features that you have, technological features in a virtual reality system, the more realistic it feels. And so that means there's things like stereoscopic vision, many levels of tracking, and wide field of view. You might be thinking, well, what do those terms mean? They're just terms that are out there. So I've showed you before, there's a Virtuality headset. So if you put the headset on, stereoscopic vision means that you get one little image slightly different in each eye. So I'd like everyone to look at an object on your desk or around you. You cover one eye, you look at this object kind of around, and then you remove your hand and you kind of look around, and you get a little bit of a different look, because the way the brain works is you get your brain works when you're looking at objects in the world, you get a slightly different image in each eye, and it comes together in your brain to help you see 3 dimensions or depth a little bit better. So headsets that make it seem like you can see 3D help it feel more real. Many levels of tracking means you can, move your hands in the environment. You can move your head and interact in lots of different ways. You can go up and down, turn around, and the world responds that way. And a wide field of view means you can see a lot of the experience in the world. So for example, if you put your hands together like this and you look at the world, you have a bit of a narrow view. And if you move your hands, you can see things onto the side of you, and you have a larger, wider field of view. So basically what this really is saying is that technologies that let you experience the world in ways that you similarly would, how you touch and move and how you see things in the world, makes it feel more real to you. And with that, we've seen that virtual reality can affect people's behaviors, such as having people do more pro-environmental behaviors, change your attitudes, such as reducing racial bias, even change your perception, how big objects are based off of how you are experiencing virtuality. So we're seeing that the technology has all these different features, but it can change how people think and feel about the world. So that coming together of the technology and the experience together. But I'm here to talk about kids in virtual reality. And so that's just a little bit about what virtual reality is, but what does that mean for kids, particularly as they're developing new skills in terms of how they think and view the world and how they socialize. So first, I'm going to talk about cognitive and social responses. So kids' ability and skills in their minds and how they socially respond. So I was very fascinated by this area. Initially, I started doing research with adults, but then I really thought more about kids, particularly in early childhood, where kids are still learning these behaviors. So preschool age is early childhood, for example, which is 3 to 5 years of age. And during this time, kids are developing higher order cognitive skills, which means more mature, more advanced abilities to think about the world, put information together, understand things. And one of those skills is called inhibitory control. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. They're also getting a more mature sense of symbolic representation. So they're understanding there's symbols in the world that represent things that are not necessarily the physical aspect of it. It's also a time when kids are getting a more mature understanding of the fantasy reality distinction. So starting to understand that, things on TV might not necessarily be real, understanding that dragons might not necessarily be real. So this is a time where they're really starting to understand that. And I thought it was interesting because virtual reality creates these really realistic, salient experiences that can grab your attention. So if you're a kid and you're still trying to get more a mature understanding of fantasy and reality, you have these really salient experiences. What does that mean for you? How are you experiencing this? And so that's what I wanted to think about. So the perceptual realism, how does it feel like real objects in sensory ways? And I was interested in how that related to kids' inhibitory control skills. Okay, what is inhibitory control? What does that really mean? Well, inhibitory control is an ability that you start to develop young and it grows more mature. It's the ability to resist temptation and impulses. It's the ability to regulate or control or manage your emotions and your behaviors. So for example, we see this little girl here, she's using her inhibitory control skills to resist touching or reaching out for these delicious looking cookies. And an interesting study by Carlson and colleagues found that young kids, they really look at the salience of an object. So the more the features of the object are enticing, the more it's harder for kids to resist them. So they did this with candy, and they found that it was hard for kids to resist pieces of candy when they just put the candy in front of them. But when they represented it more abstractly, like dots or buttons, it made it easier for them. So the less salient, the less sensory information about that really enticing thing, the easier it is for kids to resist it. So for example, in this lovely picture, if we wanted to make it easier for her to resist those cookies, we would represent them as buttons. We'd say, we can give you as many, if you don't touch these buttons, we'll give you the same amount of cookies. So the less perceptual sensory information, the easier it is for kids to resist it. But when it's really salient, really perceptually sensory, it's really hard for them to resist something. And then I was also thinking about the social realism of virtual reality, really how kids interact with other characters or embodied agents. And a study by Claxon and Ponto found that when kids got information from a live person, or they got information from a virtual character that's interactive, they had a harder time when they were younger to resist that. So for example, the person would give them information about picking out something from one of those boxes, and then the virtual character would say something different, and the kids had to decide who they were going to listen to. And this was done with 5, 7, and 9-year-olds. 7 and 9-year-olds definitely took the information from the live person, but 5-year-olds, it was about 50-50 in terms of taking information from the character versus the live person. And 5-year-olds were much more likely to say they felt that the virtual character could actually see them. And so I wanted to look more into this specifically. And so I did a research study looking at the effects of virtuality on children's inhibitory control and social behavior. So again, the ability to resist temptation, resist urges, and how they were acting socially. And so for this study, kids interacted with a virtual character, Grover in the middle here. They did it either in virtuality, or they interacted with Grover using a television screen. So something that kids are typically using in their day-to-day lives. And so what happened here, kids did a pre-test where they told us about how they were feeling emotionally and physically. Then they did a social compliance task. Then they had within the virtual experience and did an inhibitory control task. Then afterwards, I wanted to see how they were feeling emotionally and physically and how they enjoyed it. And then they did a sharing task. So the social compliance task is Grover appears in the virtual environment, the blue fuzzy character, and he says, come over here, come closer to me. And I measured, do kids actually walk up to him when he says that in VR versus a television? Inhibitory control, again, be able to resist impulses. This was done with a game of Simon Says. In a game of Simon Says, there's a leader that says, doing a behavior, such as raise your hand. And you do that behavior, you mimic it if you hear Simon Says first. So if I say Simon Says, raise your hand, you raise your hand. But if I just say raise your hand, you try not to do it. And it's actually really challenging for younger kids to resist imitating someone's behaviors. So that was the inhibitory control task and game they did with Grover. They did a sharing task where they were given stickers, and this was after they got out of VR, and they were told, oh, here are stickers for you. But also Grover is collecting stickers, and you can give him as many or as few as you'd like. And then again, the emotional distress was seeing if they were afraid, sad, worried in that moment. And pain was basically simulator sickness. So seeing if their stomach hurt, their head hurt, if their eyes hurt, or if they felt dizzy. Okay, so what happened? Kids are playing with Grover and VR or television. So what happened here? What did we see here? What was the results? So there were differences in the inhibitory control task. So kids had a harder time not mimicking Grover in VR compared to the television screen. So it's harder for them to resist doing Grover's movements. There were differences in approaching Grover. So kids in the virtual reality condition, they were more likely to walk up to Grover when he asked them to come closer to them than kids that did the same experience in television. And then there were no major differences in terms of kids sharing any stickers with Grover. But if you looked at the kids who shared stickers at all, kids in VR shared more stickers than kids with television. And this makes sense because during this age, so this is with 4 to 6-year-olds, they're still developing the ability to share equally. So stickers are very enticing. So it might have been that it was just challenging for them to do. And there were no differences in terms of kids' enjoyment or emotional distress or physical distress. So they had a good time. They actually felt less emotional distress afterwards. I think they were just a little bit nervous, and kids felt physically okay. So the implications of this study show that more immersive technologies, such as a virtual reality headset, can elicit different types of reaction from kids from less immersive technologies, such as a television screen. And then through this study, I saw a couple other just anecdotal observations that I thought were interesting. So for example, in VR, kids would say things like, "Whoa, do you see me?" And they would say that to Grover. Or, "Whoa, that's weird. Hi, Grover." Or, "He looks kind of big." Ah. And the kids in television would talk more about Grover than to Grover. So they would say things like, "I see Grover. I can hear him." Or they would ask questions like, "Oh, what should I do?" And this is when Grover would ask them to come closer. They just weren't sure what they were supposed to do here. And they would just say, "Oh," and just point at the television. So Grover was more like this thing over there in TV compared to VR, where it's more like directly interacting with him or commenting on what's going on with them and Grover. And so this led me to think about, what are kids' spontaneous reactions to virtual reality characters? And so this is just the newest work that I've been going with. And so we did a project where we just looked at children's responses to different types of characters in virtual reality. So the first study showed there are differences between VR characters and characters on television. And I was wondering, maybe there's something about Grover. Is it just a different thing? Because you're in a space with somebody else. It might be kind of weird to see a blue fuzzy character compared to maybe something else. So I wanted to kind of get a sense of that, especially if we're going to be designing experiences for kids, for medical purposes, for learning, for education, for entertainment, excuse me. And so it's important to know what kind of characters affect that. And so I'll kind of just highlight a few things with this. So kids were in VR, they saw a kid character that looked like them. They either saw a giraffe or they saw Grover. So a human, an animal, or an anthropomorphized creature. So something you can't actually see in the physical world, because VR is really good about giving you experiences that you can't normally have in the physical world. And so these results, just in looking at kids' spontaneous behaviors, most of the kids, so 88% of the kids tried to touch or reach out to the character. So they like clasp their hands or try to reach out or try to kick the character. And they did a lot more of this with Grover and the giraffe in terms of trying to touch and reach the character. And 64% of them were attempting to enter the character. So trying to be inside the character or walk through the character. And it was roughly at the same rates. And then with entering the character, kids would say things like, "I'm inside his belly," or with a giraffe, it'd say, "I'm inside the nose." And they were really fascinated by the fact that they could go inside something. And then also the next thing that we found was, as a theme that happened, was talking to the character. So kids would say a lot of things such as, "Hello, hi Grover," or "Hi giraffe," when the character appeared. And again, similar rates. And then one that was a little less common, we saw that kids were commenting about who they were in the virtual environment. So they would say, so in this experience, kids didn't have an avatar, so they didn't have an actual body, but they noticed that. Some of the kids would say things like, "I'm invisible," or "Whoa, I can't see myself. I'm a ghost." And so that was really fascinating. There might have been more kids that noticed that they didn't have a body, but they didn't necessarily vocalize it. So we just went with, for sure, kids that vocalized noticing what was going on with their representation in that environment. And so the implications of this, just saying like, what are kids just doing automatically, spontaneously to these different types of characters they're sharing space with? Well, through these themes that we've found is that, VR can be a really great way to enhance kids' exploration. So giving them opportunity to go inside something, maybe doing like a science project where they're inside an animal and understanding how biology works. And so it seems to encourage kids to go for discovery, particularly things that are unusual, such as like an animal or this anthropomorphized character. Kids use it to test social boundaries. So again, you know, playing with the idea of getting closer or farther away from something, seeing like, oh, okay, you know, in the real world, I wouldn't necessarily get that close to someone, but I'm testing out these social boundaries. And then finally, you know, avatar representation. Kids notice when they are not there. And, you know, maybe exploring this a little bit farther in terms of like what kind of avatar representation, teasing out more of, you know, how many kids are actually noticing that they're not actually there, but kids do notice it and they do comment on it. So those are kind of the implications of those two studies. And I just wanted to highlight a couple other areas that I think are interesting to consider for kids and immersive technologies, again, such as learning, using it as an opportunity to give kids new learning opportunities, visiting places they've never been, or going into, you know, learning about different anatomies or different things. And so I did a future talk where I was in Austin, Texas, and my panel was in Dubai. And that was just this images here. That's my little avatar in the background, being part of this panel from Austin, Texas, while they were in Dubai. Another area I think is important is to think about the affordances of the technology. And so that means, what do these technologies do and how can they be used for specific situations? For example, augmented reality lets you see the physical world and the virtual world at the same time. Maybe that's better for collaborations or, you know, discovery activities in the physical world with kids. But maybe it's better to have technology that blocks out the whole world, you know, particularly in medical situations where, you know, kids don't need to see that they're in a hospital where it's really scary, and it's better for them to focus their attention somewhere else. And then finally, thinking about all these different topics in terms of communities, how different communities, different cultures experience technologies, how they would use them, what's important to them, what content is important to them. And so I think another area that we need to think about broadly is how do different cultures, communities, and groups experience these things and what's important to them. And so the future of kids and interactive technology is here. The more kids I have come in, the more they say, oh, I've done this before. And so the question is, how can we use this to improve and leverage it to help kids in their day-to-day lives and understand when it's appropriate and at what age and what time. Thank you very much for your time. And my name is Jackie Bailey again. You can reach me here. This is my email address. At the University of Texas at Austin in the School of Information. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jackie Bailey, for your presentation on children's cognitive and social response to virtual reality characters. And now the next presenter, I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Andrea Stevenson. She will present about how the avatar moves the user, self-avatar embodiment, and user behavior in immersive virtual reality.
Hi, everybody. So I am very pleased to be here and also very pleased to have gone after Professor Bailey, who laid out sort of virtual reality so nicely. And now we can talk about what just came in at the end of her talk, where the children realized that they weren't embodied in avatars. So I'm going to talk today about avatar embodiment. I'm going to share my screen, and I actually tweaked it a little bit since we're being recorded. I just want to talk about published work, but we can get a little speculative toward the end. So here we go, and I'll do my slideshow from the beginning. So one question I have for everyone is, since we're talking about the use of technology, and I know that Barcelona is the seat of some amazing work in embodied virtual reality. Could I see folks' hands or have people jump in the chat to say if they've had the experience of being embodied in an avatar before? And this could be also, it doesn't have to be in the headset, although what I'm going to talk about are immersive virtual experiences in the headset. It could just be, you know, on a video game where you have a little avatar character.
Yes.
Yes, I'm hearing some yeses. I see some folks in the chat on a video game. Okay, anybody been in the headset and been able to look down and see your hands? I know that Jackie's definitely had that experience. Okay, so maybe this is still kind of an unusual, the immersive component is unusual for some folks, but I think most of us have had the experience of having an avatar, and even if it's just sort of an image on a chat board. So I'm going to talk about that today. So to run through to sort of frame the discussion of a couple of studies that I'll get into at the end, I want to talk about what are avatars and how is the experience of avatar embodiment in XR created. I'm going to just touch on these ideas of the body ownership illusion or self-presence, which is highly related to what Professor Bailey mentioned about the presence definition by Lombard and Ditton. I'll talk a little bit about some effects of avatar embodiment, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of novel avatars, or avatars where the relationship between tracked and rendered movements is different from the normal human template. So I think we all have sort of a general understanding of what the term avatar means. It's in movies, it's in popular culture. Neil Stevenson's book Snow Crash was not the first to use avatars to refer to a digital representation of a human, but it was one that really popularized that concept. So we have this idea that an avatar represents a person in a virtual setting. The term is, of course, originally a religious term, but it's a very beautiful translation from the religious meaning because it does refer to the fact that we're incarnated into this new virtual world and we can interact with it using our avatar body. So when I talk about avatars, I'm going to, to refine the term a little bit, avatars are controlled by a user, a human user. Could be an animal user actually, but for the most part, avatars are controlled by actual people, not the computer. They can be embodied, although they don't have to be embodied. They could just be a little icon by your chat thread. But when they're embodied, they allow people to navigate through virtual spaces, to interact with virtual content, to reach out your avatar hand and pick objects up, and importantly, communicate with others in a social setting through your gestures, your body posture, proxemics, how close you might get to other people you approach in the virtual environment, and even haptic feedback. If when you reach out and touch someone, they receive touch information through the system. And they also carry important information about identity, right? So even when you select your avatar in a video game, you're making choices about how you want to be seen in that virtual world. Let's see. So when we think about the social use of avatars, we think that they are, as Nowak and Fox state, they're a form of self-presentation and a way of expressing your identity that can be useful to people you're interacting with socially, and people will judge you based on what your avatar looks like and also what you do well in that avatar. So in a social virtual world, previous researchers have observed that people tend to follow similar social world rules as we do in the real world. You respect people's personal space. Gaze is used as a marker of attention. So we use our bodies in virtual environments, often very similarly to how we would use them in the real world. When people popularly talk about avatars, sometimes they use the term to refer to any digital representation of a person or a character, but we want to distinguish the definition of an avatar that represents a person from an agent avatar or a non-player character, which is an entity whose actions are controlled by a user, by a computer. And we want to make that distinction because we care a lot more about behaviors that we believe are coming from a real person as opposed to from a computer. So Professor Bailey talked a lot about examples where we see social reactions occurring even when children are interacting with agents, so characters that are controlled by the computer, and there is a level of social interaction that happens because it's hard for us to override our natural tendency to take something that looks like a living entity and behaves like a living entity seriously. But when we believe that we're interacting with a human person, then we tend to be much more influenced. But one thing I want to highlight is that there isn't a very clear line to be drawn in terms of human and computer control, because our even when we're controlling the behavior of our avatar with our motions and gestures, we're still getting a lot of assistance from the computer. And I want to talk about how that is possible. And let's see. So this is sort of a review. We talked about this already. A virtual environment is an environment where a user's movements are tracked and his or her surroundings are rendered. It replaces the cues of the physical world with virtual content. And you can be together with multiple users in this kind of environment. But to build on what Professor Bailey talked about, we know that when you're in a headset and you turn your head around, looking around at a virtual environment, the content changes in front of your eyes based on your head movements. So you can approach objects. But you can also be embodied in an avatar using the similar process. So if I have a tracker on my hand, I'm holding that in my hand, and I move my hand around in the physical world, then the system, the headset that is linked to that tracker, can adjust the way the avatar's hand is rendered on the screen in front of my eyes. So all of a sudden, instead of seeing the space and looking down and seeing that my body is invisible, if I have an avatar that's following my tracked behavior, I can look down and see a body that will move as I do. And when I reach my hand out, if I'm holding a tracker in my hand, or we're using a system that tracks hands using computer vision, then we can see the avatar move in response to my movements. And that experience is really powerful. And we can see that even the absence of that experience is something that people notice, even though it's pretty common in virtual experiences where you're just a pair of eyes and you don't see your body. People will notice that their body is missing. But putting the body into the virtual environment means that you have to make so many decisions about how the body is going to appear and how it will be controlled, and how your movements in the physical world that we're so attuned to and so familiar with are going to be represented in the virtual world in this new avatar body. So there's a lot of work that has looked at the sense of feeling present in an avatar body. So sometimes this term is called self-presence. So the sense that the avatar body is yours, that you have agency over it, and that if something happens to that avatar body, it will happen to you. Another term that's often used to describe this experience of becoming embodied in an avatar is the body ownership illusion. And I'm going to quickly talk about some ways that that can be generated. So if we look in the top left corner, we see that someone is generating a sense of embodiment in a rubber hand. Is anyone here? I want to go to, it's hard for me to see you all at once, but I'm just curious if anybody else is familiar with the rubber hand illusion. I see a couple people in chat. Okay. Cool. So I can't see. Oh yeah, 3 people. Okay, so we have some familiarity. Oh, okay, but it's Jackie and Laura, so you guys don't. Okay, so the rubber hand illusion is the idea that when you look at, and I'm sorry, I lost my slides. I was trying to get a look at everybody's faces, that you can generate a sense of ownership over a body part that is not your own by synchronously touching the body part, so your real hand, and a rubber hand that is in your field of view. And so you can see that happening in the top left part of the screen. So in this experience, the participant is seeing a rubber hand be stroked by a brush at the same time that her real hand is being stroked by a brush. And what happens is that people sort of have only one way to interpret this experience of seeing touch and vision synchronize. And that is to say, well, I feel this hand being stroked at the same time I see it being stroked. This must be my hand. So people describe the sensation of having their sense of ownership transfer over to the rubber hand. This is happening in the physical world, but you can see really easily how this kind of experience would transfer over to virtual reality. And there are a few ways that are pretty common to generate this sense of embodiment in an avatar in virtual reality. One of them is through the sense of synchronous touch, and we can see that happening in the top right, where the person is looking at an avatar face and feeling her face stroked at the same time that the avatar face is stroked. But there's another way that we can learn to experience an avatar body as our own, and that's by moving our body in the physical world and seeing those actions reflected in the virtual world. So you can see in the bottom, on the bottom left, we see someone's actions are being tracked, and then we can see what they might see through the headset, which is as they move their hand forward and rotate their hand around in the physical world, they see the avatar hand doing the same thing. And our natural interpretation of that is, this is me. When I move, I see my avatar move. This avatar is me in this experience. And even though as adults, we can override the knowledge that, you know, we have the body we've been used to for many years, this is still a very powerful sensation, and people will feel protective of these avatar bodies and learn to use them quickly. Based on these decades of experience we have of seeing our actions reflected in our physical bodies. Okay. So this idea of being embodied opens up all these incredible possibilities, because it means that we can change the experience that we're used to every day of being in your own body to looking at other people's experiences. So one thing that inevitably happens is, because avatars are not really at the point where they're photorealistic yet, is that when you're in any avatar, you're in an avatar body that looks a little bit different than your own. You could pick a very different identity where you'd say, oh, I'm elderly now, I'm a young person and now I'm elderly, so I have a new social identity. You can also do more unusual experiences where you shift perspective to different people's avatars. So I'm going to run through some quick examples, and then I'm going to talk about my favorite version, which is to embody you in an avatar that is controlled by you, but that transforms your movements in a way that's not possible in the real world. So here are some cool examples from some other projects. This is actually a project that Professor Ida Murto has done a lot of work on. So this is an image of a movie called U-Turn, that was filmed from the perspective of different actors, and you watch it from their first person perspective. So when you look down, you see the body of an actor taking actions that you don't control, and the body is not yours, but you get to view their story from their first person perspective and be embodied in their new strange body. You can experience dramatized events from the perspective of another person. So in this case, you might have low-level control of the avatar and be able to move your hands around. You would be pulled through the narrative of their life and experience events as they experienced them. You can change perspective. So this is a cool art exhibit that I won't play right now because I don't want to go over time, but you could have your camera, your view in the headset be from a camera on someone else's head, and their view through their headset would be a camera on your head. So you would have the opportunity to actually switch bodies, and as you move their hand, they would see your movements, and as they move their hands, you would see their movements. And you can also record virtual experiences and go back and walk around yourself and view yourself as you acted in the past, or view other people's experiences as you acted in the past, and sort of jump in and out of their perspective. So I think these are really exciting because we think a lot about how, and I think we're going to get some good examples in the talk later about how people can capture aspects of the real world and experience them in VR. But what I'm excited about are ways that we can think about also how we can have experiences that we can't have in the physical world at all. They can really break us out of the way we normally interact. So and I can't see the clock. So how are we for time? Are we getting? Is it 10:45 maybe?
Is 51.
Okay, I'll draw it to a close. So what I'm particularly interested in is changing the relationship between tracked and rendered movement. So I'm going to describe what I mean by that, and then I'm going to just really quickly describe two studies where we did this in different ways, and then just touch on some potential applications. So I described to you how you can feel embodied in an avatar where you reach out your hand in the physical world and you see the avatar hand reach out in the virtual world, and how this creates this sense of identification. But you can also totally break that kind of embodiment. So for example, you could say, I'm going to reach out my hand in the physical world, and when I do that, my avatar's leg will move, or my avatar will have wings, and when I reach out my hand in the physical world, my avatar's wings are going to unfurl. Or you could say, I have hands in the virtual world and in the physical world, but I'm also going to have a tail that moves as I move my back around, that'll be controlled by my movement. So you can have these, and I should have put all these citations in on this slide, but I didn't, but I can send all of the citations of these papers to you. I'll post those in the chat after we're done with the presentation. So you can have these experiences of novel embodiment where you change, you go away from the normal human template and have new kinds of embodiment. Even though this might seem like an unusual thing to do, we can think about how creating these new experiences could be used to solve some of the problems of imperfect avatar embodiment. Or to allow us to have new experiences that might be useful and even better than experiences that we can have in the physical world. So I'm going to describe two studies, one of which was published, but it's a very simple environment that we built to create recreate a therapy called mirror therapy. So this is related to the rubber hand illusion, in that it allows you to develop. Let's see, I'm trying to condense this, so I'll go quickly. This experience was designed to be used as therapy in conditions where people have an injury to one side of their body. In this case, it's an injury from a condition called complex regional pain syndrome, in which participants have one hand that is painful for no reason. And one treatment for this kind of condition is something called mirror therapy, where participants can move their hand that is not injured in front of a mirror, and they can see both hands move at the same time. And this was used as a treatment for phantom limb pain, and this was discovered by a researcher called V.S. Ramachandran. I see some people nodding, so this might be familiar to some of you. So the idea of transferring this to virtual reality is not new to us. So other people have realized that you could have this experience of novel embodiment, and you could use this to treat conditions like complex regional pain syndrome, phantom limb pain, or stroke, which are all conditions that can be helped by allowing people to control the movement of an injured body region with a sound body region. So what we did is built a module that we could share with other researchers so that other people can experiment with this way of controlling one body part by the other body part. So in this case, it just mirrors from the left hand to the right hand, or the right hand to the left hand. And so you could have a circumstance where you're trying to prompt people to use their left hand, but the right hand controls both sides of the body. So you track the right hand, and as you move that hand in space, the left hand will mirror in those movements. The reason why we wanted to make this into an open source module is because there's so many other aspects of this kind of embodiment that can be changed. So you can change the appearance of the avatar. You can change the degree to which the right hand, the uninjured hand, is controlling the injured hand. You can change whether the right hand just influences the left hand a little bit, like helps it move a little bit more, or whether it totally guides its movements. So this kind of manipulation is something that could be useful for a number of healthcare applications. In our little pilot study, we found that people were very, very interested in this experience, even though we only ran 9 people through it. So we are not claiming any statistically significant results. We found that this was because this experience was novel and engaging, that patients were really excited about the ability to use this for therapy. So we're hoping that by making this available, it will allow more people who are interested in this area, but maybe don't have a ton of interest in programming, to take this module and manipulate it to answer more questions about novel embodiment. The other study that I'm going to talk about looks at this idea that you can track human movement, but you don't necessarily need to render that movement in a human body. So this study asked the question of whether people needed to have a realistic appearance in order to interpret and react to others' nonverbal behavior. So one thing we know from other social virtual worlds is that nonverbal behavior is important. People pay attention to how other people move in a virtual space, how close they get to each other, and they'll judge other people's actions based on those behavior. But when we think about creating a realistic avatar, we have to deal with the fact that we need to make decisions about what that avatar looks like that might not match your real life appearance, and that the movements are not going to be, even though we can do pretty high level tracking, we're still going to be making system level decisions about how those movements are represented. So in this experiment, we wanted to look at how nonverbal synchrony, the relationship between 2 participants' movements, might evolve in immersive virtual reality. And we wanted to see if we could also get people to synchronize their movements if they were not seeing them rendered in an avatar. So in both of these cases, on the left, you can see people controlled avatars that looked like actual people, and when they moved their hands, their avatar hands would move. On the right, we can see that people were actually embodied in cubes, so that they did not see hands, but the same information was provided to participants because the cubes could get close to each other. They reacted to the position and the orientation of the head, so you could tell when the cube was looking at you, and they would also change size based on the hand position. So if you made a very expansive gesture in the physical world, if you were in the avatar condition, your hands would go far apart and you'd take out much space. If you're in the cube condition, then the cube would get bigger. So we tried to translate as much of the nonverbal information as we could into that virtual space. And we found some interesting things, which was that in both conditions, we did see emergent nonverbal synchrony. So people's movements tended to follow each other. So when one person moved, the other person would react. We found a really interesting difference between face-to-face interactions and virtual interactions, such that people in virtual reality tended to do more turn taking. So we're not sure whether that has to do with prioritizing audio cues, or if it has to do with sort of the simpler level of visual information that you're getting in the space. But another thing that I'm just going to touch on, because we're looking into this in a second paper, is that although there weren't any in this task, people were coming up with creative ideas. And we didn't see any statistically significant differences between the avatar condition and the cube condition, but we did see some interesting differences so in our published paper, I want to be clear with this, we don't claim any statistically significant differences between the two conditions, but we did find interesting hints at people's sort of relationships between each other's ideas in the cube condition. And so what we're investigating now is whether people are actually more creative when they're in this sort of bizarre cube condition as opposed to the avatar condition. So I think I'm getting close to time, so I'll talk really quickly about why we would do this, right? This is sort of a weird series of studies. And I talked a little bit for the first study about this idea of using novel embodiment for different health applications. So you can think about if you change the relationship between your tracked and rendered motion, this could be useful on a number of levels. So visual feedback on movement is a whole huge other area of research in which people can use visual feedback on the actions of the body to motivate people to move neglected parts of the body more, to sort of remap our perception of our body in our brain, or just to have a more exciting and motivating task. When we think about having avatars that don't look like humans, but use the nonverbal behavior of humans, then we can think about how that could be used for creative collaboration to prompt people to be more engaged in brainstorming, and also how it can avoid some of the pitfalls of avatar embodiment, where if we have an avatar that doesn't look quite like us or quite like our friend, that we might be unhappy about that discrepancy and the uncanniness of that discrepancy. So we can have sort of a new world of interaction where we're not tied to less adequate versions of avatar body. And also it's an opportunity to think about when we are not compelled to stick to the normal human template, can we have sort of inspiring experiences that are different from those we can have in the physical world. And I think now I'll turn it over to Tanya to talk about how experiences can augment the real world, which I think is what she's going to discuss.
Thank you very much, Professor Won, for this wonderful presentation. And now let's introduce our last presenter, Professor Tanya Aitamurto. Tanya is gonna talk about, the presentation is entitled Examining Augmented Reality in Journalism, Presence, Knowledge Gain, and Perceived Visual Authenticity.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me here. It's a wonderful pleasure to get to share about my work. And thank you also to Professor Bailey and Stevenson Won. It was really fascinating to hear about their work and to see then the overlap or synergies with my work. So I'm going to talk about augmented reality in journalism. So as was said, I am an assistant professor. I'm Tanya Aitamurto, assistant professor at the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And if we think about augmented reality, like the previous presenters already touched upon it, I'm going to give a little bit more detailed definition for it because we mostly talked about virtual reality in the previous presentations. So when we talk about augmented reality, we refer to a technology that projects real-time 3D our real physical environment, and oftentimes or normally more commonly via a device such as smartphone. And my puppy just decided to join this presentation, I assume. So for instance, in this picture, the user here is in an art museum using an app for getting more information about the art pieces. When she's pointing her tablet device on the picture of Mao, she gets more information about that art piece on her phone. So, and probably the most commonly known AR application that many of us have heard about or used is Pokemon Go, this kind of funny little mobile application that we can play anywhere in the world. But then oftentimes now we use AR, we don't really maybe even think about that it's AR, but we use it in Snapchat filters and Instagram filters, especially the younger generation does that. So then, of course, consequently, AR is increasingly deployed also in journalism. For instance, the New York Times has published several augmented reality visualizations alongside with more traditional visualizations in different topics with different stories. So then if we think about augmented reality in journalism, the question is, why do we use it in journalism? What's the goal of it? And the two fundamental goals are to inform and engage people. So those are the basic goals in journalism in general. So then when we introduce a new technology like augmented reality in journalism, those are the same goals we have. We want to use the new technology to give more information to our audiences and then to engage their audiences better. And then we can identify three different aspirations behind augmented reality in journalism. So the first one being about giving more information through augmentations and 3D visuals that we have in augmented reality. And there's literature showing previous studies about augmented reality in different contexts like art and science, that those studies have shown that yes, actually AR can give more information to the users than more traditional visualizations. Another aspiration is the idea of engagement through the immersive features that we have in augmented reality. And then finally, the idea of being able to provide a more accurate and more authentic picture of the topic by providing the visuals in AR. And these notions of accuracy and authenticity are, of course, very fundamental for journalism, which is all about telling the truth and showing the world as is. So when we think about these three different claims or aspirations, giving more information, more engagement, and a better, more accurate, more authentic picture to the users. So these three questions then inspired our study, where we wanted to examine the role of AR in journalism. This paper was recently published in New Media and Society, and it's a big paper. There's a lot of different aspects to it. So if you want to read it, here's a bit.ly link to it. I will just touch upon certain aspects of the paper. I will not go to everything in detail. And we did the paper with my wonderful co-authors, Laura Aymeric Frank, Jorge Saldivar, Sukosak Sakshuwang, Catherine Curtis, and Yasamin Sareki, who were all part of different stages of this study. So we had three basic research questions we wanted to address. How does augmented reality affect users' knowledge gain, sense of physical presence, and then the user's perceptions of authenticity, credibility, and accuracy of the visuals? And I'm going to focus on the two first questions here because in the interest of time. So we ran a mixed experimental study with 79 participants, and this study design has a lot of detail to it. So I'm going to try to be as brief, but give the relevant information. If you have any questions later, I'm happy to address those. So what happened in the study was that each participant first, when they came to the session, experimental session, they took a pre-survey, which inquired about their background variables. And then we also had dependent variables where we wanted to measure the potential change between pre and post. So we had those questions about knowledge gain, subjective knowledge gain, meaning the perceived knowledge gain, what the users think they learned. So after taking the pre-survey, each participant was randomly assigned to one of the three conditions, either to view visuals in mobile AR, mobile interactive, or mobile static viewing modality. And I will tell in a minute more detail about these different conditions. And then in each of these conditions, the participants would see three different visuals in a randomized order. And after seeing each visual, they would take a post survey. And in the post survey, we would have dependent variables presence, both objective and subjective knowledge gain, and then perceived accuracy, authenticity, and credibility. And then also we did a short interview after each, with each participant after each, after they have seen each visual. And then more detail about the stimuli we used. So we sourced our stimuli from the New York Times. We used 3 different visualizations that were available both in augmented reality and in a more traditional interactive visualization. So, and the 3 different viewing modalities we had were augmented reality, interactive, or static. And I'll explain what this means. So first, the first topic was about was a story about Olympic figure skater Nathan Chen, and the visualization showed the mechanics, the process of him doing a quadruple jump. So, and the second topic was about chemical bomb in Syria, and the visualization showed the space where this bomb was found, and it was a reconstruction of that space. And we are seeing the screenshots here show the AR versions of the visualizations. And then the final topic was a rescue operation in Thailand, where a soccer team was stuck in caves in Thailand. And then the visualizations were showing how the caves looked like. And then, so these same topics, it didn't matter what the viewing modality was, it was always these same 3 topics. So that was the AR viewing modality, how that looked like. So the interactive viewing modality, again, the same topic, the same information, but the visualization was a little bit different. It wasn't augmented reality, it was interactive digital visualization that was created by the New York Times, as we can see in this screen capture here. And then finally, the static viewing modality, we wanted to have this as a control condition. This we created ourselves from the interactive viewing modality, interactive visualization. So we just froze the images. It was like a PDF. There was no interactivity in this viewing modality. So just to recap once more, so what happened in the study was that every participant was randomly assigned to one of the 3 viewing conditions, and then they saw the 3 visuals in that viewing condition in a randomized order. And this is how the experimental setting looked like in the AR condition. So you can see the space, we had a grid overlay on the floor so that we could also measure the distance and the time, how long the user spent with each visual. And but there were no statistically significant results from the distance moved or the 12 time. So that should give a little bit of an overview how the experiment looked like. So then towards the findings. So when we look at augmented reality and how it affected the user's knowledge gain, what we found was that no, augmented reality didn't contribute to users' knowledge more than other viewing modalities. Yes, in every single condition, the users learned, they felt their perceived knowledge went up after they had they saw the visuals, but it didn't matter how what technology was used to show the visual. The user still thought that they learned. I have a lot of details about the knowledge measures. I'm not going to go into those because it can take a long time. But if you just look at the table quickly that shows the change in perceived knowledge in pre and post surveys, so we can see that there's increase in all conditions, in all visuals, except for the Thai, there was a slight decrease in one of the conditions. But so then going deeper with the knowledge gain, we wanted to know more about it. So then we analyzed the interview results. So we had over 200 interviews to analyze, because remember we had 3 visuals and we did an interview after each visual, and we had 79 participants. So we analyzed the interview results and we found that there were certain main categories that the users mentioned where they learned, within which they learned. So, and those were mechanics, detail, scale, experience, dimensions, shape, and size. And when we look at the perceived knowledge gain based on this interview analysis, based on each, let me see that I can show this the best, with each condition. We can see that the users in the AR condition, they felt like they learned most about details compared to interactive and static. But then it's not that straightforward. In interactive and static, the users felt like they learned most about mechanics. Mechanics refers to the process of like showing what's actually happening in the image, for instance, in the visual, for instance, with the Olympics visual, about the mechanics of the figure skater jump. And then regarding size, both in interactive and in AR condition, the users felt like they learned most about the size of what the visual was depicting. So then we wanted to go still deeper to when we wanted to understand about, so what did the users actually learn? So we looked at the frequencies by modality and article, and we found that it was more about the interplay of the content and modality that affected knowledge gain rather than just the technology, the modality. So, and what does this mean? So let's look at this, each of these results based per each visual. So the results for the Olympics visual, in each condition, the participants felt that they learned most about the mechanics when we're talking about the Olympics visual, in augmented reality, interactive, and static. So it was about the visual, the Olympics, figure skater visual was designed to convey a lot of information about mechanics. So then regardless of the viewing modality, that's how the users got, that's the information the users got. Same thing about detail. So, the Surya visual. So there was a certain category, knowledge category, namely detail, that the participants in all conditions felt like they learned the most in augmented reality, interactive, and static conditions. So, and that makes sense because the Surya visual was designed with a lot of detail about the bomb attack scene. Well, the Thai visual is a little bit more scattered. So in the interactive and static conditions, the participants felt that they learned more about scale than in augmented reality condition. But then in AR and interactive conditions, they felt like they learned more about size than in the static visualization. So again, it's not only about the technology, how the user sees the visual on which platform, but it's so much about the content and how the visual is designed. So this is how what was one of our main conclusion about knowledge gain in general based on these results. Same thing with the objective knowledge gain measure. So with objective knowledge gain, we mean the actual knowledge that the users gained during the experiment when they were viewing the stimuli, meaning as compared to the subjective knowledge, which means the perceived knowledge, like what they think they learned. Objective knowledge is what they actually learned. And we had a couple of different types of questions to measure objective knowledge gain. There were no statistically significant differences between the conditions. So in the interest of time, let's move on to the findings about presence. So we measured physical presence as defined by Lee, meaning that we were measuring the differences between the conditions, like how the users felt if they were in a psychological state in which virtual objects were experienced as actual physical objects. And just like Professors Bailey and Stevenson already mentioned, there's a difference in presence in VR and presence in AR, in the sense that when we talk about presence in AR, we generally talk about, because in AR, we project the objects to our reality, the reality where we are at. And then the object, the virtual object, is brought to our environment. So we can get a feeling that it is here. So this is the notion of presence in AR. Whereas in VR, most commonly the goal is to transport the user to this other virtual reality, to the other reality, which is the virtual reality. So that's the big difference between the presence in AR and VR. But of course, it's a fine line, especially with mixed reality and the AR glasses and all that. Presence measures, just going forward from those, what we found was that users in the AR condition felt more presence than in the other conditions. So yes, augmented reality was able to induce stronger sense of presence than the more traditional visualizations. And presence here, how we define it, can translate into engagement. So we use presence as a proxy for the possibility for or capacity for engagement. And what is really interesting, and when we look closer to the notion of presence, is that the users, based on their interview results and answers and the open-ended survey answers, they felt that they were in the same space with the virtual objects, like these quotes here show. As one of the participants who, after seeing the Olympics visual, they said, at first we were in the same room for a moment, for a second. So that's a pretty profound feeling of presence, sense of presence, considering that they were only viewing these visualizations on a mobile phone. So it's not a big screen. Another participant, after seeing the Syria visual, said, it felt like I was in there actually inspecting the crime scene. It felt like it was real. And what's interesting about this one is that the participant is saying that they felt like they were there. And remember, we just talked about AR bringing the objects to us, but this person felt that they were transported to the crime scene. Also, another person, after seeing the Syria visual, said, I felt for a moment that I'm roaming inside the room, the way the objects and debris have been protected. Again, there was a notion of transportation. They were inside the room. And why is this? Well, if you look at the visuals again, the AR visualizations, what they show us. So the Olympics visual clearly brings in the figure skater to our space. It's like the figure skater is visiting our room here. Whereas the second one, the Syria visual, we can see that it creates a room. So we can actually walk around the room a little bit and inspect all these different objects there. Same thing with the Thai cave visual. The last one here, it creates like an illusion of as if you were in a cave. So what we can see here is that really the notion of presence in AR can vary a lot depending on what the visual is showing. So if it's a space, like in the case of Syria and the Thai cave, the user can feel that they are transported to that space, even just for a brief moment though, in these cases. Interestingly, also the Thai cave, that visual induced the weakest presence, and we concluded it's because the users were mentioning that the Thai cave was the least realistic of the visualizations. They were just like black graphical presentations of the caves, and the users were hoping that they were more detailed and more realistic, maybe photorealistic elements in those visuals. I'm going to skip the findings about authenticity, credibility, and accuracy. There were no statistically significant differences between the conditions. So again, we can't say that AR would create a more accurate or credible or authentic picture to the viewers. So now to recap, what we can say here is that when we look at our main interest, which was the idea of what augmented reality can do in journalism, it could potentially inform and engage people more than traditional visualization would. And then we had these 3 points of interest. Does AR bring us more information? Does it create more engagement through presence? Does it create more accurate and authentic perceived accuracy and authenticity of the visuals? So, and the results show that no, in terms of information, AR doesn't provide more information or doesn't create informational import compared to more traditional visuals. And instead of the technology being the determining factor of in the knowledge gain, it's actually more on the design and the purpose of the visuals, the content, that determines what the users learn. Because if you remember the results that show that in each visual, what the users learned, the categories were different. So if it was the Surya visuals, regardless of the condition, the users would learn more about the details because the visual had so many details in it, whereas in the Olympics visual, they would learn about the mechanics of the jump. Engagement, yes, the users felt stronger physical presence with the AR visual, and they even felt these some notions of transportation. So then we can conclude with this question that we were left with after this study, that what is the role of presence in journalism? Because we can see that there is, the users feel a sense of presence in journalism when they view these visuals as augmented reality visuals in journalism. But how could we harness the power of presence in these AR visuals to serve journalism better? So with this, thank you. Thanks for listening. Happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for introducing this very interesting topic about augmented reality in journalism. And now for the last part of this session, I would like to open the floor to questions. So if someone has any question, you can just open your mic and talk.
I have questions for all of you. Thank you all for such interesting presentations. I wanted to start with Professor Tanya Ardamunto. I was wondering, you mentioned two quotes that were relevant to the Syria chemical bomb when you were talking about being in the same space. And I wanted to ask you about more like further applications, more your opinion than anything else. I was thinking about this idea that the images of the Vietnam War helped change the public perception about the war. But nowadays we're perhaps too high, too accustomed or too numb in a way to certain images of war. Can augmented reality then in journalism generate different emotional responses to news that are perhaps harder to swallow? Can it make us more emotionally involved in war news, for example? Do you believe it could be useful for that kind of emotional engagement of the public?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for the question. Especially thinking about the effects of virtual reality and 360-degree video or immersive video in journalism. There has been a ton of studies about the viewers' empathetic response or emotional response to those videos, and it's a mixed bag about whether the 360 videos about showing people suffering in refugee camps or experiencing homelessness, that whether that then can create a stronger emotional response than more traditional flat video would. So I would say the same could apply in AR, that especially if it would be, there's a really interesting New York Times augmented reality visualization about it's this horrible story here in the United States, the Emmett Till murder a long time ago. So they created like a visual representation about how those events evolved, or part of it evolved. So I would think that in topics like that are emotionally so touching, maybe the technology then can push the emotional response further, because if you can really feel like you're experiencing the events more firsthand than you would with traditional visualizations. So yes, AR could make a difference. But again, it's the same question that we have with virtual reality and with 360-degree video, that it's not that straightforward that the technology only would then create stronger emotional response. It's so much about the content and the design of the story too. So because your questions was about the war journalism and whether if we see war imagery in AR, would it be more impactful emotionally? Yes, it could, but it not would be the case always. It would depend so much about how the story was designed and what the content of it was.
Just actually so interesting. I was wondering about this too. This is just another note of why it might be a mixed bag that I've learned somewhat relatively recently. There's a psychologist, his name's Jamil Zaki, and he has a theory about empathy and what factors influence when and how much someone will empathize. And they found that in some cases, when people feel very deeply or a lot of emotion, it's overwhelming to them and they empathize less, because I think it's kind of like a saving yourself a little bit. So it could be the case that in some cases, certain personalities are so overwhelmed by the visuals and by the experience of it that they don't empathize as much. Also, things such as competition can influence whether or not people empathize. And so it's really interesting. It could be the case that maybe AR in some ways is slightly better because there's a little bit of a disconnect. And maybe in some cases, the content, like you were saying, was so overwhelming with the interactivity, or maybe it wasn't engaging enough. So there are things about how people process information that can influence how much and when they empathize as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up, because it is not, I think we oftentimes approach empathy or any emotional response very straightforward, but actually there is this notion about protecting yourself, shutting yourself off when you don't understand what's going on, or if it's too much to process. And all that then plays in when you're seeing these visuals. Also, the previous knowledge, your previous experience about the topics, and especially in these applications like journalism, which every visual can be so complex. It has the history about the topic, and then the user also brings in their history, their background, what they know about it, and how they have felt about it before. So as an object of study, it's actually much more complex than we can show in these studies.
Thank you very much for answering. I don't know if there is any other question. I have one myself also.
I had another question, sorry. I don't mean to monopolize the conversation. Sorry. I had a question, maybe both for Professor Andrea Stevenson and for Professor Jackie Bailey. You mentioned it briefly, but I wanted to know regarding what we were talking about just now, implications about with VR and avatar embodiment in integrating different communities and different cultures, and perhaps even in children, increasing tolerance or increasing empathy, as you said. Have there been any experiences, or do you have any idea of how it could work? I'm especially interested in children. I don't know anything about this type of technologies or about psychology in particular, but I think that it's especially interesting to study children that are like native digital small beings that are more malleable in their impressions about the world. And I was wondering, could this be like a definitive tool for integrating communities and building tolerance? I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Andrew, do you want to go first, or?
I can make one comment, but I think thinking about kids, you would have, like, you've thought a lot about this and have insight. And but I guess one thing that when people ask about empathy generating experiences through embodiment, which is something that there is a lot of work on, that one tricky part is that the experience of being embodied in an avatar feels very powerful, and looking at someone else's body from the first person perspective feels very powerful. The one risk is that you might have the impression that you had more insight than you really did, because it feels like this powerful experience, but of course you're not the person whose avatar you're wearing. You're just getting a second of looking down at their body from the first person perspective. So that's one thing where it's a really interesting area of research, but I think the people who do the best job with that look at that in the context of a much bigger program of sort of self-reflection. But in terms of but I know that this is something that Jackie has also thought a lot about. So, but that's sort of what I always think of as like, there's an illusion of understanding that you might feel very quickly that you might want to be really cautious about.
Yes, I would echo what Andrew is saying. It's a very understudied area for kids, but it's a big thing that people wonder and talk about. And I think that is the thing that, you know, repeating what Tanya said, is that you really need to think about the content and how it intersects with that technology. So Andrew is saying it's a very powerful thing where you feel that that's your body. I feel like that's you when you see your avatar, even if it doesn't move or look like you. But you need more than that, because you want it to feel more than just putting a costume on. Because at some point, if you just see your body and you just see that, it's like a costume. And there has been previous studies with VR where it shows it can prime stereotypes. So it has the exact opposite of what you want. So you need to have that body, but you need to have them live that experience to some degree, with more of a narrative, so they can understand what that representation means in the context of other things. Because you want to be careful where you don't have the exact opposite, where, you know, people are just using the information that they know, maybe a stereotype that they have. And you particularly when, you know, thinking about kids and making you want to have a better generation than the previous generation. So you want to be really thoughtful about helping them understand and process that social information. I would probably say when you get into adolescence, that's the age when they're very sensitive to social information, social interactions, exclusion. And so you have to be, again, careful of how you want to do that. But I think that age is probably a really great age to kind of really think about those social, cultural things, because they're very sensitive to that information, because their brains have gotten more mature and understanding about social information, but they're still learning how to process that emotionally and understand about how to regulate themselves in that way as well.
Thank you. So since we are dedicating this session to the frontiers of knowledge and to start wrapping up the session a bit, I would like to conclude by asking you, what do you think is the next big thing we're going to be studying in our area?
I'm going to jump in and guess. So we're already looking at social interactions, but I think that this past year and a half has really pushed people to think about both the pros and cons of being social virtually. So we've seen a lot of the disadvantages, but there's been a little, even amidst everybody's struggles, there's been some insights into the advantages of virtual social interaction and how it can augment or replace Zoom in some cases, or even what Zoom can do, like that sort of virtual experience. So I think that that area already exists, but I think it warrants a lot more investigation, and we already see sort of an uptick in that this past year.
Yeah, I would think that learning in virtual reality, especially now in the pandemic, different virtual environments for learning in social VR, adding the social component to it. I think that would be, I don't know if it will be, but I would hope it would become a main area for study.
Yes, I think I'm clearly obviously in the social aspects. One thing that I think is interesting is I think we'll see as these technologies are going to start to blend more and more on a spectrum. And I'd be curious, kind of touching on all of these different things, is how do people start to wonder and distinguish between what is real information, quote unquote, accurate information, real information, when you start integrating these other aspects where you can augment things in many different ways and change experiences and represent yourself and represent other people, and how we're able to really make progress with that. But on just like a basic level, in the medical field, I think more and more people are understanding how to integrate these things into the medical field, and also in terms of like architecture and building in a way that we've never, in a new and interesting way. But I'd just be curious about, we're in this age where people are still trying to understand disinformation and misinformation. And what does that mean when you start integrating that in new ways and adding social aspects to that? And so, for better, for worse, it's just going to be really interesting to see what those social dynamics do in terms of people getting more access to have these more immersive interactions together.
Thank you very much. So we're out of time. It was wonderful to hear these presentations. I hope to everyone that was here today, we had this opportunity to hear about 3 different lines of research that hopefully will help us to get an overall picture of how immersive, how virtual and augmented reality are studied from the communication and media psychology perspective. Thank you very much to Jackie, Andrea, and Tanya for being here with us today. It was a great honor. And well, hopefully we have the opportunity in the future again. Thank you.